Hi, I'm Samir. Welcome to Legends from the Past. On this channel, I transform history's greatest stories into epic narratives while maintaining historical accuracy. My mission is simple: to breathe new life into the tales of kings, conquerors, and empires that shaped our world. Here, you won't just learn about history, you'll live it. From the battlefield strategies of legendary commanders to the intimate thoughts of ancient rulers. Tonight's tale takes us to ancient Egypt, where we'll follow the extraordinary life of Ramses II, a pharaoh whose ambition to achieve immortality would quite literally change the face of history. This is Egypt's immortal pharaoh, a tale of ambition, power, and the price of eternity. So sit back and join me as we journey into the past, where myth meets reality and legends come alive. Let's begin.
Death carried a sweet perfume in the land of the pharaohs. Young Ramses learned this truth on a sweltering afternoon in the embalming chamber, where natron salt and sacred oils mingled with the metallic tang of eternity. The boy who would become Egypt's greatest pharaoh stood motionless in the shadows, his heart thundering beneath his linen tunic as he watched the priests prepare a noble's body for its journey to the afterlife. He wasn't supposed to be there. The mysteries of preservation were forbidden to those uninitiated in the sacred rites, even to a prince of Egypt. But curiosity had drawn him like a moth to flame, down torchlit corridors and past drowsing guards, until he found himself pressed against a limestone column, watching Master Embalmer Nacht work his eternal craft. The embalmer's hands moved with the precision of a sculptor, each gesture carrying the weight of thousand-year traditions. His obsidian blade gleamed in the lamplight as he made the sacred incision. Ramses fought the urge to look away, forcing himself to witness every detail of the ritual that would one day preserve his own flesh for eternity. "The gods grant us this knowledge," Nacht murmured to his assistants, his voice carrying in the chamber's perfect acoustics. "But it is time that proves our worth." The old embalmer's fingers traced hieroglyphs in the air as he spoke, invoking ancient prayers. 70 days we labor, that the car might find its eternal home." A sudden draught stirred the incense smoke, drawing serpentine patterns in the air. Ramses held his breath, pressing deeper into the shadows, but it wasn't the guards who had discovered him. It was something far more terrifying. The young falcon emerges from his nest early, it seems. The voice belonged to his father, Pharaoh Seti I, living Horus of Egypt. It carried neither anger nor surprise, only a weight of knowing that made Ramses's spine stiffen. The boy turned slowly, facing the towering figure of his father. Seti stood like a statue of Osiris himself, his broad shoulders draped in white linen that seemed to catch every trace of light in the shadowy chamber. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt rested upon his brow, and his eyes held the same penetrating wisdom that gazed out from every monument bearing his likeness. "Father, Ramses began, but Seti raised a hand, silencing him. "You wish to understand death, my son?" The pharaoh's voice was gentle now, thoughtful. "Then let us understand it together." He placed a hand on Ramses' shoulder, guiding him from the shadows into the chamber proper. The embalmers immediately prostrated themselves, but Seti waved them up. "Continue your sacred work," he commanded. "My son requires this lesson." Nacht straightened, his wise old eyes meeting Ramses' gaze with unexpected warmth. "The young prince honors us with his interest in our craft," the embalmer said, bowing his head. "Perhaps he would like to learn the prayers that guide the car to its rest." Before Ramses could respond, a new voice cut through the chamber's thick air. "The prince should learn many things before he concerns himself with death." High Priest Amenemhat stepped from a side chamber, his leopard skin cloak marking his exalted status. His shaven head gleamed in the lamplight as he approached, each step measured and deliberate. Ramses felt the tension rise in the room like floodwaters. There was something in the way Amenemhat looked at him, not with the usual deference shown to a prince, but with calculating assessment, as though weighing his very soul against Ma'at's feather of truth. "Come, young prince," the high priest said, extending a hand. "Let us speak of life before we contemplate its ending." But Seti interceded, his presence filling the space between his son and the priest. "My son will learn all things in their proper time, Amenemhat. For now he will understand what awaits all men, even kings. The next hour passed in a blur of sensation and revelation. Ramses watched, asked questions, absorbed every detail as Nakht explained the sacred processes. The old embalmer spoke of natron's salt that dried the flesh, of linen bandages soaked in resin, of canopic jars that would cradle a man's essence through eternity. With each explanation, Seti added context, weaving together the practical and spiritual aspects of Egypt's most sacred art. "Why must the heart remain?" Ramses asked, watching as Nakht carefully arranged the internal organs, all but the heart, in their ceremonial vessels. "The heart is the seat of soul and memory," Seti explained, his voice taking on the cadence of ceremony. "In the Hall of Two Truths, it will be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. All that we do in life, all that we think and feel, is recorded in its chambers." Ramses absorbed this, his young mind racing. Then a pharaoh's heart must be heavy indeed, with the weight of all Egypt upon it. The comment drew sharp looks from both Amenemhat and Nakht, but Seti's deep laugh echoed off the limestone walls. "Already you think like a king, my son. But remember, it is not the weight our hearts carry that matters to the gods, but how we bear it." As if to emphasize his father's words, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. A guard burst in, forgetting protocol in his haste. "My pharaoh, urgent news from the northern border." The shift in Seti was immediate. The contemplative father vanished, replaced by Egypt's living god and protector. "Speak," he commanded. "Raids along the delta, my king. The Libyans test our strength again." Seti's jaw tightened. "Then we shall teach them the price of such tests." He turned to Ramses, his eyes holding a new intensity. "Come, my son. You have learned enough of death for today. Now you shall learn how a pharaoh protects his people." As they strode from the embalming chamber, Ramses cast one last look at the body being prepared for eternity. Something had changed in him during those hours among the embalmers. The mystery of death had touched him, but it had awakened something else, a hunger to understand power in all its forms. They emerged into the brilliant Egyptian sun, where reality ruled with a harder hand than ritual. Seti was already calling for his generals, his mind turning to matters of defense and retribution, but Ramses lingered a moment, blinking in the harsh light, his thoughts still in that shadowy chamber where men worked to defeat time itself. A movement caught his eye, a flash of dark hair and linen disappearing around a corner. Maya, the artisan's daughter, had been watching again. She was like him, always seeking knowledge beyond her station. Their eyes met for just a moment before she vanished, but in that brief connection, Ramses felt something important pass between them. They were both outsiders looking in, trying to understand the machinery of power and eternity. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of military preparations. Ramses watched his father transform the palace into a center of martial activity. Messengers raced through columned halls, generals argued strategy in the map room, and the clash of bronze against bronze rang out from the training grounds. Among the chaos, one figure caught Ramses's attention. General Horemheb, his father's most trusted military commander, stood apart from the other officers. The old warrior's scarred face was turned toward the northern horizon, his expression grave. "You see something in the distance, General?" Ramses approached carefully, knowing Horemheb's reputation for brusqueness, even with royalty. The general's weathered face creased in a subtle smile. "I see what all old soldiers see, young prince. The next battle calling." He turned his full attention to Ramses, studying him with eyes that had witnessed countless conflicts. "Your father tells me you've been watching the embalmers at their work." Ramses squared his shoulders, expecting criticism, but Horemheb surprised him. "Good," the general said. "A warrior should understand death before he deals in it, just as a pharaoh should know the weight of souls before he commands them." He gestured to the training grounds below. "Tomorrow you begin your lessons with the sword. Today has taught you how men are preserved. Tomorrow you learn how they are unmade." That evening, as the sun set over Thebes, Ramses sat in his chambers with his friend and rival, the young scribe Pentuer. They had known each other since childhood, their friendship forged in shared lessons and palace adventures. But lately, Ramses had sensed a change in their dynamic, a current of tension beneath the surface. The embalmers let you watch their sacred work. Pentawa's voice carried a note of envy. Even I am not permitted such access, and I am training as a temple scribe. Father made it a lesson, Ramses explained, carefully omitting that he had been there without permission first. He says a pharaoh must understand all aspects of Egyptian life and death. Pentawa's stylus scratched against papyrus as he recorded the day's events, a habit he had developed early in their friendship. "And what did you learn, future King of Kings?" There was something sharp in his tone, hidden beneath the formal words. Ramses was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally he spoke. "I learned that immortality has a price, my friend, and I'm not sure yet if I'm willing to pay it." Pentawa looked up from his writing, surprise flickering across his features. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by the simple warmth of shared contemplation. "Perhaps that understanding is worth more than immortality itself," the young scribe said softly. That night, sleep eluded the young prince. His mind kept returning to the embalming chamber, to the precise movements of Naket's hands, to the weight in his father's voice as he spoke of a pharaoh's heart. But most of all, he thought about Maya's questioning gaze and Pentawa's hidden envy, reminders that even a future god-king was bound by the complicated web of human relationships. In the darkness of his chamber, Ramses made his first real choice as a future pharaoh. He would learn everything: the sacred and the secular, the arts of peace and war, the weights and measures of both power and responsibility. And somehow he would find a way to bridge the gap between the divine immortality he was born to claim and the human connections he was not yet ready to sacrifice. The moon rose over Thebes, casting long shadows through the palace windows. Somewhere in the city below, embalmers continued their eternal work. On the northern border, soldiers prepared for battle. And in his chamber, a young prince lay awake, his heart already growing heavy with the future he would have to bear. Tomorrow would bring new lessons: Horemheb's martial training, Amenemhat's religious instruction, and the countless other preparations required of Egypt's heir. But for now, Ramses was content to lie in the darkness, feeling the subtle shift in his soul, as childhood simplicity began to give way to the complexity of the path that lay before him. It was the first night of many he would spend thus, caught between the mortal world and the divine, between the warmth of human connection and the cold allure of eternal remembrance. The seeds of greatness had been planted in fertile soil, watered with the mysteries of death and the responsibilities of power. What would grow from them, only time, that most patient of teachers, would reveal. The Great Pyramid cast its shadow like a sundial of destiny across the sacred sands, marking time not in hours, but in dynasties. Ramses stood at its base, neck craned back to study the ancient monument's towering face, while his father's words echoed across the limestone plateau. "Here lies the weight of all our traditions, the foundation of our divine right to rule." 3 months had passed since that fateful day in the embalming chamber. Summer's brutal heat had given way to autumn's more temperate embrace, and Ramses had changed as surely as the seasons. His arms bore the first bruises of weapons training, his mind wrestled with sacred texts, and his young shoulders had begun to straight under the growing weight of expectation. Seti placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch carrying both affection and authority. "Your ancestors rest here watching. They judge not just our actions but our worthiness to carry their legacy." The pharaoh's voice carried a strange urgency that Ramses had never heard before, an undertone that spoke of hidden purposes. They were not alone at the pyramid's base. A small retinue accompanied them. High Priest Amenemhat, still watching Ramses with that calculating gaze. General Horemheb, whose martial lessons had left the prince's muscles aching, and a cluster of nobles whose names carried the weight of Egypt's oldest families. Among them stood Lord Pasa and his daughter Nefertari, newly arrived from their Delta estates. Ramses found his attention drawn to the girl who stood slightly apart from her father. Nefertari carried herself with a grace that belied her 11 years, her dark eyes missing nothing as they swept across the gathered assembly. When their gazes met, she offered not the expected demure glance away, but a direct look that carried both intelligence and challenge. "The sacred journey begins here," Seti announced, his voice carrying across the plateau. For 40 days, we shall trace the footsteps of the gods themselves, visiting the temples and monuments that mark their passage through our lands. My son will learn the weight of divine kingship, and Egypt will see its future. The announcement sent a ripple through the assembled nobles. Such journeys were rare, undertaken only in times of great significance. Ramses caught fragments of whispered speculation, the pharaoh's health, the succession, so soon. But before he could dwell on these murmurs, Amenemhat stepped forward, his leopard skin cloak stirring in the desert wind. The first trial awaits, my prince. The gods demand proof of worthiness before revealing their mysteries. The high priest led them to a narrow opening in the pyramid's northern face. This passage was sealed for centuries before your grandfather's time, he explained. It leads to a chamber few living eyes have seen. You must enter alone, young prince, and retrieve the ancient scroll that lies within. Ramses studied the dark opening. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The darkness beyond seemed to pulse with age-old secrets and forgotten dangers. He glanced at his father, seeking guidance, but Seti's face was an unreadable mask. "Remember your lessons," General Horemheb muttered, just loud enough for Ramses to hear. "A warrior's courage isn't about feeling no fear, it's about mastering it." Taking a deep breath, Ramses stepped into the passage. The darkness swallowed him immediately, the limestone walls pressing close on either side. The air grew thick with the dust of ages, and each step echoed with the weight of antiquity. He fought down the urge to retreat, forcing himself to continue despite the growing sense of claustrophobia. The passage descended at a steep angle, requiring him to brace against both walls to maintain his footing. His fingers traced hieroglyphs carved into the stone, ancient prayers and warnings that he could feel but not read in the darkness. Time seemed to lose meaning in that narrow space between past and present. Finally, the passage opened into a small chamber. A shaft of light penetrated from some hidden opening above, illuminating a simple stone altar. Upon it lay a scroll case, green with age, sealed with symbols Ramses recognized from his lessons, the mark of Thoth, god of wisdom. As he reached for the case, a voice spoke from the shadows. "Some treasures carry curses, young prince. Are you certain you wish to claim this one?" Ramses spun, heart pounding, to find Pentuer stepping from a hidden side passage. The young scribe's face bore an expression the prince had never seen before, a mixture of challenge and desperation. "How did you—" Ramses began, but Pentuer cut him off. "There are many paths to knowledge," the scribe said, moving closer. "Not all of them run through palace halls or royal bloodlines." He gestured to the scroll case. "That text contains secrets meant for priests and scribes, not warriors or kings. Leave it, and I'll show you truths your father's lessons will never reveal." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Their friendship, already strained by status and circumstance, balanced on a knife's edge. Ramses looked at the boy who had been his closest companion, seeing him truly for the first time. The hunger in his eyes, the tension in his stance, the weight of ambition that matched his own. "Knowledge serves the throne," Ramses said finally, the words coming not from his lessons but from some deeper understanding. "And the throne serves Egypt. That is the only truth that matters here." He took the scroll case, watching something break and reform in Pentuer's expression. The scribe bowed, the gesture containing both acceptance and warning. "Remember this moment, my prince. Remember that you chose power over friendship." "No," Ramses corrected, his voice firm despite his youth. "I chose duty over desire." "There's a difference." When Ramses emerged from the pyramid, scroll case in hand, the assembly erupted in approval. But he barely heard their praise, his mind still dwelling on Pentuer's words and the price of choices. His father's approving nod carried less weight than the calculating look Nefertari gave him, or the knowing smile that played at the corners of Maya's mouth as she watched from her position among the artisans. The journey that followed took them the length and breadth of Egypt. They traveled by royal barge up the life-giving Nile, stopping at temples and monuments that marked the empire's glory. At each site, Ramses underwent new trials, physical challenges that tested his strength, riddles that probed his wisdom, ceremonies that measured his piety. At Abydos, home of Osiris, he spent 3 days in ritual purification, learning the sacred mysteries of death and rebirth. The temple priest spoke in riddles and metaphors, testing his understanding of divine principles. A pharaoh must die each night like Ra, they taught, and be reborn each morning with the sun. In Karnak's vast temple complex, he walked the processional way lined with ram-headed sphinxes, each step carrying him deeper into the realm of divine kingship. Amenemhat taught him the secret names of gods and the proper way to make offerings, while in the temple's shadows, Maya's father and his fellow artisans worked to restore ancient carvings. It was during their stay at Karnak that Ramses first truly spoke with Nefertari. He found her in the temple gardens, studying a papyrus scroll with an intensity that matched his own hunger for knowledge. "The histories of queens," she explained without looking up, "particularly those who ruled as regents for young pharaohs." "Planning your future already?" Ramses asked, trying to match her self-possession. Now she did look up, her dark eyes meeting his directly. "Aren't you? Or do you think the crown will simply fall into your lap like ripe fruit?" The challenge in her voice should have angered him, but instead he found himself intrigued. Here was someone who saw beyond the divine facade to the human calculations beneath. Their conversation that afternoon ranged from politics to poetry, each discovering in the other a mind that matched their own. But the journey's peaceful moments were few. At each stop, new challenges awaited. In Memphis, he faced 3 days of martial trials under General Horemheb's stern guidance. The old warrior pushed him to his limits, teaching him that a pharaoh's strength must be more than symbolic. "Your enemies will not bow to divine right alone," Horemheb growled as they sparred beneath the scorching sun. "They must fear your sword as much as they respect your crown." The general's lessons were interrupted by urgent news from the Delta, more Libyan raids, growing bolder with each success. Ramses watched his father's face grow grimmer with each report, noted the way Seti's hands occasionally trembled when he thought no one was watching. The journey's final leg brought them to Giza once more, but this time they ascended the Great Pyramid itself. The climb was treacherous, each massive stone block a test of strength and will. Ramses's muscles burned, his breath came in gasps, but he refused to show weakness before the assembled nobles who watched from below. At the pyramid summit, with all Egypt spread before them like a living map, Seti finally revealed the journey's true purpose. The great pharaoh's voice was weaker than Ramses remembered, though his words carried the same authority. "I am dying, my son," he said simply, gesturing to the vast expanse of their realm. "The physicians give me perhaps a year, though I suspect it will be less. You must be ready to take the crown sooner than any of us wished." The words struck Ramses like a physical blow. He looked at his father, really looked, and saw what others had surely noticed months ago: the slight stoop to those proud shoulders, the graying at his temples, the way each movement seemed to cost him more effort than it should. "The sacred journey was never about testing you," Seti continued. "It was about preparing you. Every trial, every lesson, every moment of these past 40 days has been aimed at one purpose: making you strong enough to bear the weight that comes next." As if to emphasize his words, the setting sun painted the pyramid's shadow across the desert floor, a great dark triangle that stretched toward eternity. Ramses watched it grow, understanding now why his father had chosen this moment, this place, for such a revelation. "I am not ready," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. Seti's laugh was gentle but firm. "No pharaoh ever is, my son. The crown's weight cannot be understood until it rests upon your brow. But you have shown me something more important than readiness. You have shown me wisdom." The pharaoh placed both hands on his son's shoulders, the gesture both blessing and burden. "You chose duty in the pyramid's heart. You saw beyond Pentawa's temptation, beyond your own desires. You have begun to understand that a pharaoh's power comes not from his divine right, but from his service to Egypt herself." As darkness gathered around them, Seti extracted a promise from his son: not to be the greatest pharaoh, not to build the tallest monuments, but to remember always the human heart that beat beneath the divine crown. It was a promise Ramses would spend the rest of his life trying to keep, even as destiny drew him toward greatness he could not yet imagine. That night, as the royal camp settled beneath the stars, Ramses stood alone at the pyramid's base. The massive stones seemed to pulse with the weight of ages, with the accumulated wisdom and folly of all who had ruled before him. In the distance, he could see the lights of Memphis, where his people lived and worked, loved and died, their lives bound to his by bonds both sacred and profane. The boy who had watched embalmers preserve flesh for eternity was gone. In his place stood a young man beginning to understand that true immortality lay not in monuments of stone, but in the legacy one left in the hearts of others. As he turned to walk back to camp, Ramses caught sight of three figures watching him from the shadows. Maya, whose common wisdom had taught him to see beyond palace walls, Pentawer, whose ambition had shown him the price of power, and Nefertari, whose intelligence promised partnership he had not known he needed. They were all part of his path now, threads in the tapestry of his destiny. As he moved toward his future, Ramses carried with him not just his father's lessons or the priest's teachings, but the understanding that even a living god must walk in the company of mortals. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal as the gods themselves, while below a young prince took his first true steps toward becoming Egypt's greatest pharaoh. The path ahead was long and would demand sacrifices he could not yet imagine, but for now he was content to feel the weight of destiny settling onto his shoulders, one choice, one lesson, one human connection at a time. Death came to Pharaoh Seti, not as a thief in the night, but as an expected guest whose arrival still somehow managed to shock the household. The great king's final breath rattled through the cedar-scented air of his chamber like the last grain of sand falling through an hourglass, marking the precise moment when Prince Ramses became something more and something less than his father's son. Ramses knelt beside the royal bed, its gilded posts throwing long shadows in the lamplight. His father's hand, once strong enough to bend a warrior's bow, now lay cool and still between his own. Behind him, the assembled priests had already begun their death hymns, their voices rising and falling like waves on the distant sea. But Ramses heard only the echoes of his father's final words, spoken hours before when they were briefly alone. "The crown breaks all who try to bear it gently," Seti had whispered, his voice cracking with urgency. "Be hard when you must, my son, but never cruel. There lies the difference between a great king and a mere tyrant." Now, as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and blood, Ramses felt the weight of those words settling onto his shoulders alongside the burden of kingship. The room had grown crowded with nobles and priests, their whispered conversations forming a web of ambition and calculation that even grief could not entirely mask. "My Pharaoh." The voice belonged to General Horemheb, and Ramses noted how naturally his old teacher used the new title. "The council awaits your commands." Ramses rose slowly, feeling the eyes of every person in the chamber measuring his worth. He was young, too young, some whispered, to bear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. But youth had not stopped other great pharaohs, and he had been preparing for this moment since that day in the embalming chamber so many years ago. "Begin the preparations," he commanded, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath. "My father shall have a tomb worthy of his reign." As if his words had broken some spell, the chamber erupted into activity. Priests moved forward to begin the sacred rituals of preparation, while nobles clustered in corners, already plotting their positions in the new order. But before Ramses could take more than a step toward the door, a familiar figure appeared at his side. "The border commanders send urgent reports." Nefertari's voice was pitched low, for his ears alone. She had grown into her beauty since their first meeting at Giza, but it was her keen mind that had drawn them closer over the years. "Nubian raiders struck 3 villages near the first cataract. They're testing your resolve already." Ramses nodded slightly, unsurprised. News of Seti's illness had spread like poison through the empire's extremities, encouraging old enemies to snap at Egypt's heels. They would learn soon enough that the lion's cub had grown his own teeth. The next hours passed in a blur of decisions and ceremonies. The embalmers came to begin their sacred work, led by Nakt's son, who had inherited both his father's position and skill. Priests chanted endless prayers while scribes recorded every detail of Seti's passing for the temple archives. Through it all, Ramses moved with careful precision, each word and gesture measured against his father's teachings. It was near midday when Pentuer found him in a quiet corner of the palace gardens. The young scribe's rivalry had mellowed into a complex friendship over the years, though Ramses never forgot that moment of choice in the pyramid's heart. "The people gather in the streets," Pentuer reported, his stylus moving constantly across a sheet of papyrus. "They wish to see their new pharaoh, but there are currents beneath the surface. Not everyone celebrates your ascension." "Speaking of currents," a new voice interrupted, "the temple guards caught someone trying to access the sacred scrolls of kingship." Maya stepped from behind a column, her presence in the palace no longer as unusual as it once had been. Her father's skill had earned him the position of master artisan, and she had grown into a valuable source of information about the common people's thoughts and fears. Ramses absorbed these reports in silence, seeing the pattern they wove. Already the jackals were circling, testing his defenses, searching for weakness. They would find none. "The coronation cannot wait," he decided. "Have the priests make ready. Egypt must see her pharaoh crowned before the sun sets on my father's death." The announcement sent ripples through the palace complex. Such haste was unusual. Traditionally, weeks or months might pass between a pharaoh's death and his successor's coronation. But traditional times called for traditional measures, and these were not traditional times. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ramses stood before the great temple of Amun-Ra, stripped to the waist as priests purified him with sacred waters. The ritual cleansing would normally have taken days, but Amenemhat had agreed to abbreviate the ceremonies, perhaps sensing the same urgency that drove Ramses. The high priest's eyes held a knowing look as he anointed Ramses' brow with oil. "The gods forgive haste when necessity demands it," he murmured. "But they never forget the debt of proper ceremony. Remember that, young king." The coronation procession began at the temple gates, where thousands of citizens had gathered to witness the birth of a new era. Ramses wore the simple white shendit of a prince for the last time, his broad shoulders bare except for a collar of gold and lapis lazuli. Before him walked the priests carrying sacred standards. Behind him came the nobles and officials of his court, and above all rose the steady beat of ceremonial drums. He felt the change in the crowd's energy before he saw its cause. A subtle shift in the rhythm of their chanting, a ripple of movement that seemed wrong somehow. Then Nefertari's voice cut through the ceremonial songs. "My Pharaoh." The warning came an instant before chaos erupted. A figure burst from the crowd, bronze blade gleaming in the dying sunlight. Time seemed to slow as Ramses processed details his combat training had taught him to notice. The assassin's perfect balance, the professional grip on the weapon, the calculated angle of attack. This was no desperate peasant, but a trained killer. Captain Amenemheb's reaction was instant and precise. The guard commander's ceremonial spear swept out, catching the assassin's legs, even as two other guards seized the attacker's arms. The knife clattered against limestone, as the would-be killer was forced to his knees before the future pharaoh. Silence fell like a blade. The crowd held its breath. The priests stood frozen mid-chant, and even the drums fell quiet. All eyes turned to Ramses, measuring his response to this attack on both his life and his authority. In that moment, Seti's final words echoed in his mind. "Be hard when you must, but never cruel." Looking down at the captured assassin, Ramses saw not just one man's malice, but a challenge to everything he would spend his life building. His response now would set the tone for his entire reign. "Who sent you?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. The assassin's silence was answer enough. A professional, then, one who would die before betraying his employer. "So be it." "You came seeking to make history," Ramses declared, raising his voice so all could hear. "Let it be recorded that on this day, when Egypt's enemies thought to find weakness in transition, they found instead the strength of eternal law." He turned to Captain Amenemheb. "Execute him, now. Let his blood consecrate the beginning of our reign." The captain's sword flashed once in the dying sunlight. The assassin's defiant expression had just enough time to shift to surprise before his head struck the limestone with a dull finality. The crowd's gasp transformed into a roar of approval as Ramses raised his hands, blood-stained limestone beneath his feet. "See how Egypt deals with those who would tear at her fabric," he proclaimed. "Let all who plot against her know that mercy is a gift of the strong, not a right of the weak. We begin our reign as we mean to continue, with swift justice and unwavering resolve." The rest of the coronation passed in a blur of ritual and ceremony, but that moment on the temple steps had already done what hours of formal rites could not. Ramses saw it in the eyes of the nobles who had thought him too young to rule, in the straightened backs of his guards, who had witnessed decisiveness in crisis, and in the fierce approval of the common people who valued strength they could understand. Later, as the double crown was placed upon his brow and he took his place upon the throne of his ancestors, Ramses felt the weight of both victory and responsibility. He caught Nefertari's eye among the assembled nobles, saw in her slight nod both approval and warning. Power, her look seemed to say, was like the Nile itself, life-giving in proper measure, devastating in flood. The sun had set by the time the new pharaoh finally retired to his chambers. The day's events had transformed him in ways no amount of preparation could have predicted. His father's body lay in the hands of the embalmers, an assassin's blood stained the temple steps, and the crown of Egypt rested upon his brow. But as he stood at his window, looking out over the city that was now his to protect and rule, Ramses knew that this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring reports of Nubian raids to address, nobles to manage, and 1,000 decisions that would shape the empire's future. But for now, in the quiet of his chamber, Egypt's new pharaoh allowed himself one moment to feel the full weight of all that had changed. The boy who had once watched embalmers at their work was gone forever. In his place stood a man who had learned his first lesson of kingship. Sometimes the crown's weight was measured not in gold, but in blood. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he commanded, turning to find Pentawa standing in the doorway, his ever-present writing materials in hand. "The temple scribes wish to know how to record today's events," the scribe said carefully, "particularly the incident on the steps." Ramses considered for a moment, remembering his father's lessons about the power of historical narrative. "Record that Egypt's new pharaoh began his reign by defending her honor," he said finally, "and that those who witnessed it saw the strength of ages flowing through their king's veins." He paused, then added, "But first record my father's passing, and ensure that all who read it know the greatness they have lost." As Pentawa bowed and withdrew, Ramses turned back to his window. In the streets below, he could still hear the sounds of celebration mixing with the eternal rhythms of city life. Tomorrow those streets would fill with mourners for his father, and then with those eager to curry favor with the new king. But tonight, in the space between one reign's end and another's true beginning, Ramses allowed himself to wonder what sort of pharaoh he would become. The answer he knew would be written not in temple chronicles or scribal records, but in the choices he would make and the lives he would touch. His father had taught him that a pharaoh's true legacy was measured not in the height of his monuments, but in the depth of his impact on his people. Now it was his turn to prove worthy of that teaching. The moon rose over Thebes, casting silver light across the ancient stones that had witnessed the passing of countless kings. In his chamber, Ramses, now pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, living Horus, son of Ra, began planning his next moves in the great game of power and legacy that would define his reign. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the gods themselves waited to see what sort of king would emerge from this day of endings and beginnings. Bronze gleamed like captured sunlight along the ranks of assembled spearmen, their weapons rising above the morning mist like reeds along the Nile's banks. Before them stood Ramses, no longer wearing the ceremonial regalia of a god-king, but the battle armor of a warrior. The breastplate bore the scars of his training, each dent and scratch a lesson written in metal by General Horemheb's relentless tutelage. The army had assembled on the plains outside Memphis, 20,000 strong. Their campfires drew a constellation across the desert floor, marking the gathered strength of Egypt's military might. The air hummed with the sound of whetstone against blade, the stamp of horses' hooves, the murmur of prayers to Montu, god of war. But beneath these martial sounds lay another rhythm, the quiet fears of men preparing to march into battle, each wondering if he would return to see his family again. Ramses felt their eyes upon him as he moved through the ranks astride his war chariot. He had chosen this vehicle carefully, not the gold-plated ceremonial chariot befitting a pharaoh, but a battle-tested model identical to those his officers would drive. The wooden frame creaked beneath his feet, its familiar sound bringing back memories of countless training hours. "They watch to see if you fear what lies ahead," General Horemheb said, riding alongside. The old warrior's face bore the weathered look of one who had spent decades beneath campaign suns. "Show them the strength they need to see." The young pharaoh nodded, understanding. This campaign would test more than military might. It would prove whether Egypt's new ruler could lead men into battle, whether the crown's weight would steady his sword arm or burden it. Before he could respond, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced approaching riders. The scouts he'd sent to probe the Nubian positions were returning, their horses lathered with the effort of hard riding. Their commander, a scarred veteran named Amenemhat, no relation to the high priest, dismounted with fluid grace despite his obvious exhaustion. "My pharaoh," he reported, kneeling briefly before rising to deliver his news. "The Nubians gather in force near the Second Cataract. Their numbers are greater than expected, at least 15,000 warriors, led by chiefs who mock your youth and call you the boy king who hides behind Egypt's walls." A ripple of angry muttering passed through the nearby officers. Ramses raised a hand, silencing them. "And what do they say of Egypt's walls, these raiders who prey on helpless villages?" "They say the walls grow weak without Seti's strength to maintain them," Amenemhat replied, his voice tight with controlled rage. "They say the time has come to test their strength." Ramses absorbed this, feeling the weight of his officers' attention. His response now would set the tone for the entire campaign. He turned to address not just his commanders, but all within earshot. "Then let us educate them," he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. "Let us show them that Egypt's strength flows not from any single pharaoh, but from the might of her people and the favor of her gods. We march at dawn." The army moved south like a river of bronze and leather, supply boats keeping pace along the Nile. Ramses rode at their head, but he was not immune to the rigors of the march. He ate the same rations as his men, slept in a soldier's tent rather than a royal pavilion, and spent each evening walking among the troops, learning their names and stories. It was during one such evening walk that he found Maya among the camp followers. She had joined the army's scribes, officially to record the campaign for the temple archives. Unofficially, her presence served another purpose. Her keen ears caught the whispered words of common soldiers, taking the army's temperature in ways no official report could match. "They call you Horus in human form," she told him, her voice low as they stood at the camp's edge, watching the sun set over the desert. "Not because of your title, but because they've seen you share their burdens. It matters to them." Before Ramses could respond, another figure emerged from the gathering darkness, Pentawa clutching a sheaf of papyrus. The scribe's usual scholarly demeanor had been replaced by urgent tension. "My pharaoh," he said, glancing meaningfully at Maya. When Ramses nodded, indicating she could stay, Pentawa continued. "My agents report movement among the noble houses that opposed your coronation. They gather resources, whisper of contingencies, should this campaign fail." "Vultures circling already," Maya observed, her tone bitter. "They forget that even a young lion has claws." "Let them circle," Ramses replied, his voice hardening. "It will make it easier to see them when the time comes to strike." He turned to Pentawa. "Keep watching. Record every name, every whispered word. When we return victorious, there will be a reckoning." The first blood was drawn 3 days later, when Nubian scouts clashed with their Egyptian counterparts in the rocky hills overlooking the Nile. Ramses was with the vanguard when the warning horns sounded. He had time only to don his helmet before the enemy was upon them. Swift desert raiders armed with short bows and curved swords. The battle was brief but fierce. Ramses found himself in the thick of it, his chariot driver, a veteran named Mena, maneuvering with practiced skill as the pharaoh's bow sang. Time seemed to slow in the way his teachers had described, allowing him to pick his targets with deadly precision. When it was over, 30 Nubians lay dead or captured, while only 3 Egyptians had fallen. As he stood over the battlefield, watching the sun paint the rocks red, Ramses felt the change in how his men looked at him. He was no longer just their pharaoh, he was their commander, blooded in battle as they were, but the victory's satisfaction was tempered by the sight of the dead being prepared for burial. He knelt beside one of his fallen soldiers, memorizing the man's face. "His name was Amenemope," General Horemheb said quietly, approaching from behind. "He left a wife and 2 sons in Thebes. What shall I tell them, my pharaoh?" Ramses stood, decision crystallizing. "Tell them their father died helping to build an empire, and tell them that Egypt remembers her fallen." He turned to his commanders. "From this day forward, the families of those who fall in Egypt's service will be cared for from the royal treasury. Let it be proclaimed throughout the army." The policy would strain the kingdom's resources, but the impact on morale was immediate and profound. That night, the camp buzzed with renewed purpose. Soldiers spoke of their pharaoh not just as a warrior, but as a leader who understood the true cost of battle. The main Nubian force awaited them near the Second Cataract, where the Nile's rage turned navigation treacherous. They had chosen their ground well. High cliffs commanded the approach while the river protected their flank. But Ramses had spent the march studying maps and listening to scouts, and he saw what his enemies had missed. "The cliffs are their strength," he told his commanders in the pre-dawn darkness, "but they are also their weakness. They expect us to approach along the river road where their archers can bleed us dry. So we shall not." The plan was audacious, perhaps even reckless. While a third of the army made an obvious approach along the expected route, Ramses himself would lead the main force through a series of wadis that his scouts had discovered, emerging behind the Nubian position. It was a gamble that required perfect timing and complete surprise. As he prepared for battle, Ramses felt the weight of his decisions pressing down harder than any crown. 20,000 lives hung upon his judgment, and behind them the fate of Egypt herself. He touched the gold ring his father had given him, remembering Seti's words about the burden of command. The attack began with the sun at their backs, Egyptian war horns shattering the desert morning. The Nubians responded exactly as Ramses had predicted, rushing to meet the threat along the river. Their surprise was total when Egypt's main force erupted from the wadis behind them, Ramses' chariot at their head. What followed was chaos distilled into its purest form. The sound of clashing bronze filled the air like thunder, while war cries in a dozen languages rose above the din. Ramses found himself fighting with mechanical precision, his training taking over, as he directed both his chariot and his troops. Mena's handling of the reins was perfection itself, allowing the pharaoh to use his bow with devastating effect. A Nubian chief recognized Ramses by his armor and pressed forward, seeking the glory of killing Egypt's young king. Their chariots passed close enough for the chief to shout a challenge in his native tongue. Ramses answered with an arrow that found the gap between the chief's leather armor plates. As the man fell, his forces began to waver. The battle's tide turned with the sun's crossing of the zenith. Caught between hammer and anvil, the Nubian army began to fragment. Their discipline, already looser than the Egyptian forces, broke completely when a flanking maneuver cut off their retreat. By mid-afternoon it was over. The desert sand had drunk its fill of blood, and Egypt's armies stood victorious. The aftermath was both triumph and tragedy. As Ramses walked the battlefield, he saw the cost of his victory written in broken bodies and shattered weapons. Egyptian healers moved among the wounded of both sides, offering what aid they could. The young pharaoh stopped frequently, speaking with injured soldiers, learning their names, carrying their messages for families back home. "A pharaoh who remembers the common soldier," observed Horemheb, watching this progress. "They will follow you anywhere after this day." "They followed me here," Ramses replied, his voice heavy with responsibility. "And too many will never follow anyone again." He gestured to where burial details were preparing the dead for their journey to the afterlife. "Victory's price is paid in others' blood, old friend. I must never forget that." The army's return to Memphis became a triumph, unlike any Egypt had seen in a generation. Word of the victory had preceded them, and the streets were lined with cheering crowds throwing lotus blossoms before the returning warriors. Ramses had ordered that the common soldiers march ahead of him, giving them the first taste of glory. He found Nefertari waiting at the palace steps, her presence both diplomatic and personal. She had managed affairs of state in his absence, handling the noble houses with such skill that even his enemies had found no cause for complaint. When their eyes met, Volumes passed between them without a word being spoken. That evening, as victory celebrations filled the city with light and song, Ramses stood alone on his palace balcony. The sounds of jubilation rose from the streets below, but his mind was already turning to the future. The Nubian campaign had secured his southern borders and proven his military prowess, but it was only the beginning. Reports from the north spoke of growing Hittite power, of ambitious kings who watched Egypt's transition with calculating eyes. The noble houses that had hoped for his failure would need to be dealt with, alliances would need to be forged, and monuments would need to be raised to commemorate both victory and sacrifice. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, as he watched the celebration fires mirror the stars above, Ramses allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had achieved. He was no longer just his father's son, no longer the untested youth whom nobles had dared to challenge. He had proven himself both warrior and leader, tactician and king. A soft step behind him announced Nefertari's presence. She joined him at the balcony, her quiet strength as essential to him now as air itself. "The people sing your name in the streets," she said, "but I see the weight in your eyes. What troubles Egypt's victorious Pharaoh?" Ramses turned to her, seeing in her face the same complexity of thought that had first drawn them together. "Victory opens as many doors as it closes," he replied. "Each path forward carries its own price, its own consequences. Then we shall weigh each choice carefully," she said, taking his hand, "and we shall build something that will outlast bronze and stone." As if to emphasize her words, a new chant rose from the streets below, not just cries of victory, but something deeper. The people were calling him Ramses the Great, their voices carrying the weight of prophecy. The name settled onto his shoulders like another piece of royal regalia, both honor and burden combined. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal as the gods themselves, while below a young pharaoh stood at the threshold of his destiny. He had proven himself in blood and battle, earned the respect of enemies and allies alike. But as he stood there, feeling the night wind against his face, Ramses knew that this was just the first step on a much longer path. The real work of becoming Egypt's greatest pharaoh still lay ahead, waiting in the darkness beyond tomorrow's dawn. But for now, for this one moment between victory and destiny, he allowed himself to simply be, a man who had faced his trials and emerged stronger, a king who had earned his crown in dust and glory, a ruler who was beginning to understand the true measure of greatness. The celebration fires burned through the night, their light reflecting off the ancient stones of Memphis, like memories of ages past. And in their glow, Ramses and Nefertari stood together, planning the future of an empire that would echo through eternity. Truth, like gold, was often found in the darkest places. This ancient wisdom echoed through the torch-lit chamber beneath Ramses's palace as the Hittite assassin's blood dripped onto limestone floors older than empire itself. The man's breathing came in ragged gasps, his once fine clothes now stained with the price of failed ambition. But it was his eyes that held Ramses' attention. They burned with the peculiar fire of a zealot even in defeat. "Your death was foretold," the assassin spat, his accent thick with the harsh consonants of the north. "The empire of Hatti will—" His words dissolved into a choking cough as Captain Amenemheb's grip tightened on his throat. "Enough prophecy," Ramses commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that 8 years of rule had carved into its timbre. "I want names." He stepped closer, allowing the torchlight to catch the gold of his ceremonial collar, creating a corona that reminded all present of his divine status. "Who else serves your master in my court?" The assassin's laugh held the edge of madness. "They are everywhere, great Ramses. In your temples, your armies, your very chambers. The serpent's coils wrap tighter than you know." Before Ramses could press further, a commotion at the chamber's entrance drew his attention. Nefertari swept in, her presence transforming the grim interrogation chamber through sheer force of dignity. Her eyes met Ramses with an urgency that transcended ceremony. "My king," she said, using the formal address that meant this was matters of state, not marriage. "We found this in Amenemhat's chambers." She held out a clay tablet covered in the cramped cuneiform of Hittite diplomatic code. The name struck Ramses like a physical blow. Amenemhat had been more than his advisor. He had been a friend since childhood, a confidant who had stood beside him through the challenges of early rule. The tablet's implications coiled in his stomach like an asp waiting to strike. "Show me," he commanded, taking the tablet. As he studied the alien script, the assassin's laughter rang out again, this time with genuine mirth. "Now you begin to see," the man gasped through his injuries. The mighty Ramses, who thought himself beloved by gods and men alike, surrounded by vipers in his own nest. Ramses handed the tablet to his senior scribe Pentawer, who had grown from ambitious youth to trusted advisor. "Verify this against our records of intercepted messages," he ordered. Then to Captain Amenemheb, "Double the guard on Amenemhat's chambers. Let him think we suspect nothing, yet." The night that followed was one of whispers and shadows. As Ramses moved through his palace's lamplit corridors, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. Every servant's bow seemed to hide secrets. Every guard's salute might mask treachery. The assassin's words had taken root in fertile soil, feeding paranoia with the blood of betrayed trust. He found Nefertari in their private chambers, surrounded by papyrus scrolls and clay tablets, the accumulated correspondence of years of rule. Her fingers were stained with ink, her face bearing the intense concentration he had first fallen in love with so many years ago. "How deep does it go?" he asked, knowing she would understand the question's full implications. She looked up, her dark eyes holding both love and steel. "Deeper than we thought, not as deep as we feared. I've been tracking the pattern of information flow from our court to Hattusa. The leaked intelligence goes back at least 2 years, but it's selective, calculated." "Amenemhat," Ramses said, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. "Yes, but he's not working alone." Nefertari rose, moving to the window where the first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky. "Think, my love. How did he gain access to military dispatches? Who helped him pass messages beyond our borders? This is larger than one man's betrayal." The truth of her words settled onto Ramses' shoulders like another weight added to the crown he bore. He had known since taking the throne that leadership meant hard choices. But this, the necessity of rooting out treachery among those he had trusted, had called friend. This was a new kind of burden. Dawn found him in the war room, surrounded by his most trusted commanders. General Horemheb's weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent reviewing troop deployments, searching for signs of compromise. The old warrior had been like a second father to Ramses, teaching him the art of war alongside the art of kingship. "The Hittites know too much," Horemheb growled, his finger tracing supply lines on the map spread before them. "Every move we've made in the past year, they've countered before we could gain advantage. Now we know why." "Not every move," Ramses corrected, his mind racing ahead like a chariot in full charge. "They know what Amenemhat knows, what his conspirators can access. The question is, what don't they know?" A slow smile spread across the general's scarred face as he caught his pharaoh's meaning. "A trap within a trap?" "Exactly." Ramses began moving markers on the map, his movements quick and decisive. "We let them think they know our plans. Meanwhile, the real strategy remains in shadows." The next weeks became a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the gilded corridors of power. Ramses watched as Amenemhat continued his daily routines, attended councils, offered advice, all while hidden eyes tracked his every move, noted every contact, recorded every whispered conversation in darkened corners. The evidence mounted like blocks in a pyramid's foundation, coded messages intercepted at border posts, mysterious meetings in Damascus's crowded markets, gold traced back to Hittite coffers. But most damning of all was the gradual revelation of the conspiracy's true scope, the network of spies and traitors that had wound its way through Egypt's power structure like roots through fertile soil. The breakthrough came on a night when the moon hung full and heavy over Thebes, like an overladen scale waiting to tip. Ramses was reviewing troops at the city's northern garrison when Nefertari's fastest messenger arrived, bearing news that could wait for neither ceremony nor dawn. "We found the proof, my king," the young man gasped, still breathing hard from his run, "in the false bottom of a grain shipment bound for Damascus. Battle plans, troop movements, everything they would need to counter our northern campaign." Ramses felt time slow, as it did in the heat of battle when life and death hung on a single decision. "Who signed the shipping orders?" "Amenemhat, my king, and—" The messenger hesitated. "Speak. And your cousin Amenemope, commander of the border garrison at Bubastis." The weight of the name struck like a mace blow. Amenemope, who had fought beside him against the Nubians, who had shared wine and stories around campaign fires, who had saved his life during that first desperate battle of his reign. The betrayal tasted like ashes in his mouth. Dawn painted the sky blood red as Ramses stood on his palace balcony, watching the city come to life below. Behind him, he heard the soft step that could only be Nefertari. "The arrangements are made," she said quietly. "The guard is doubled. They will be taken at midday, when the sun god Ra stands at his zenith." Ramses nodded, his hands gripping the balcony's stone edge until his knuckles whitened. "A public arrest, a public trial, a public execution." "The people must see justice done," she agreed, "and our enemies must see the price of betrayal." The arrest, when it came, was as swift and decisive as a cobra's strike. Ramses sat in full regalia upon his throne as Amenemhat was brought before him in chains. The great hall was packed with nobles and officials, all watching the drama unfold with the hungry eyes of jackals at a kill. "Why?" Ramses asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent chamber. "You were my friend, my advisor. I trusted you with Egypt's secrets, with my own counsel." Amenemhat lifted his head, and in his eyes Ramses saw not fear or shame, but a burning conviction that was somehow worse than either. Because Egypt has grown soft under the rule of god-kings who think themselves immortal. The Hittites are the future, their iron weapons, their war chariots, their strength. I sought to save Egypt by helping to humble her. "And how many Egyptian lives would you sacrifice for this salvation?" Ramses rose from his throne, his voice thick with controlled rage. "How many villages burned, how many soldiers died because the enemy knew our movements in advance?" The trial was brief, the evidence overwhelming. When the execution order was given, Ramses forced himself to watch. A pharaoh who ordered deaths should have the courage to witness them. Amenemhat's head fell with a finality that seemed to echo through the palace complex. But there was no time to dwell on personal loss. Reports from the northern borders spoke of massive Hittite army movements. The enemy was gathering strength, emboldened perhaps by the intelligence they had purchased with gold and treachery. In the war room, surrounded by maps and dispatches, Ramses began to forge strategy from the ashes of betrayal. The game had changed. No longer was this simply about territory or trade routes. This was about the future of Egypt herself. "They think they know our plans," he told his assembled commanders, his voice hard with purpose. "Let them think so. While they prepare to counter a phantom army, we will strike where they least expect." General Horemheb leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with renewed fire. "The road to Kadesh?" "The road to Kadesh," Ramses confirmed. "But first we have vipers to clean from our own nest." The purge that followed was surgical in its precision. Guided by the evidence gathered through weeks of patient surveillance, Ramses' loyal commanders struck simultaneously across the empire. Border garrison commanders, temple officials, noble conspirators, all were taken in a single night of reckoning. Amenemope's arrest was personal. Ramses led the guard detail himself, riding through the pre-dawn darkness to the Bubastis garrison. His cousin's face, when confronted with the evidence of his treachery, showed neither denial nor remorse. "You've grown strong, cousin," Amenemope said as the chains were fastened. "Perhaps strong enough to survive what comes next." "What comes next," Ramses replied, "is justice." The second execution was harder than the first. Family blood, even treacherous blood, weighed heavier than friendship. But Ramses stood firm, understanding that mercy now would be seen as weakness by both allies and enemies. As the sun set on that day of reckoning, Ramses stood in his private sanctuary, a small chamber whose walls bore the carved stories of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. Here, away from the weight of ceremony and the eyes of court, he allowed himself to feel the full impact of what had happened and what was still to come. Nefertari found him there, as she so often did when the burden of rule pressed heaviest. Without a word, she took his hand, her presence offering strength without demanding acknowledgement of weakness. "The army awaits your command," she said after a long moment. "The northern road is ready." Ramses nodded, his eyes fixed on a carving of Thutmose III, the warrior pharaoh whose conquests had built empire. How does history judge a king who must first break trust to preserve trust? Who must sacrifice friendship to save his people? History, Nefertari replied with the wisdom that had made her his most valued advisor, judges by results, not intentions. Clean your house of serpents, my love. Then show the world why Egypt's pharaohs are remembered as gods. The next days were a whirlwind of preparation. Troops mustered, supplies gathered, weapons forged and sharpened. But beneath the obvious activity lay a deeper current, the careful construction of false intelligence, planted evidence, and misdirection. Let the remaining Hittite spies report what they saw. Let them think they still held advantage. The true plans, known only to Ramses and his most trusted commanders, were committed to memory rather than papyrus. The largest army Egypt had ever assembled would march north, but not as their enemies expected. The road to Kadesh would become a legend, written in blood and glory. On the night before the army's departure, Ramses stood upon the highest tower of his palace, looking north toward destiny. Below, the city burned with 10,000 torches, while beyond the walls campfires marked the assembly points of his army. The air hummed with the energy of approaching battle. "My father once told me that a pharaoh's greatest test is not in victory," he said to Nefertari, who stood beside him, "but in the choices he makes on the road to victory." She turned to him, her face grave in the torchlight. "And what do you choose, great Ramses?" He was silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of crown and consequences, of betrayal and destiny. Finally he spoke. "I choose to be remembered, not just as a conqueror, but as a king who burned away weakness to forge strength, who faced betrayal and emerged stronger, who turned treachery back upon itself to serve Egypt's glory." The moon rose over Thebes, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. In those shadows, a pharaoh prepared for war, his heart hardened by betrayal, but strengthened by purpose. The road to Kadesh beckoned, promising either immortal glory or devastating defeat. But first had come this quieter victory, the rooting out of serpents from his garden, the forging of trust from the ashes of betrayal. Tomorrow would bring the thunder of chariots and the clash of bronze. But tonight, in the silence between preparation and action, Ramses allowed himself one final moment of reflection. The boy who had trusted too easily was gone, replaced by a king who had learned the true price of power. Whether history would judge him harsh or wise, only time would tell. The night wind carried the smell of torch smoke and weapon oil, of incense from 100 temples, and the sweat of 10,000 warriors preparing for battle. It was the scent of empire and ambition, of betrayal and redemption. It was the scent of destiny, calling Egypt's greatest pharaoh toward his date with immortality. Destiny, like the great river Orontes, moved with currents both seen and hidden. As dawn painted the sky above Kadesh in shades of flame and gold, none in Ramses's vanguard division could have known they rode into the jaws of history itself. The morning mist rose from the river like incense from 1,000 censers, while ahead the mighty fortress of Kadesh thrust its ancient walls toward heaven, silent, waiting, pregnant with secrets that would birth both legend and death. Ramses stood in his chariot, the reins loose in his hands as he trusted Mena, his driver, to navigate the familiar path. The pharaoh's armor caught the rising sun's light, transformed him into a living statue of gold and bronze. Around him, the pride of Egypt's army advanced with the confidence of conquerors, cavalry scouts ranging ahead, infantry marching in precise formations that had been drilled into muscle memory, supply trains stretching back toward the horizon like the tail of some great serpent. "Those Bedouin scouts brought interesting news, my king," General Horemheb said, his own chariot drawing alongside Ramses. The old warrior's face bore an expression that decades of combat had carved into stone. "The Hittites have retreated north of Kadesh, they say. Mu'atali fears your approach." Something in the general's tone caught Ramses's attention. "You doubt their word?" Before Horemheb could respond, a sound split the morning air, a sound that should not have been possible given what their scouts had reported. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the screech of chariot wheels, the war cries of an army that was supposed to be leagues away. Time seemed to crystallize into a single, perfect moment of horrified understanding. The mist that had seemed so beautiful moments ago parted like a curtain, revealing the truth their enemies had hidden behind its veil. 2,500 Hittite chariots, the finest heavy cavalry in the known world, emerged from their concealment behind the fortress of Kadesh. The morning sun caught their iron weapons, weapons that were supposed to be far to the north, and turned them into blinding stars of death. Ambush! The cry rose from 1,000 throats, but it came too late. The Hittite chariots struck the unprepared Egyptian lines like a bronze fist, shattering formations and sending men flying in broken arcs through the air. The sound was unlike anything Ramses had ever heard in battle, the shriek of metal on metal, the screams of horses and men, the thunderous impact of coordinated cavalry striking infantry who had no time to form defensive squares. "My king!" Mena's voice cut through the chaos as he fought to control their chariot horses. "The division breaks. We must fall back." But retreat was already impossible. The Hittite attack had split the Egyptian army like a wedge splitting wood. Ramses found himself cut off from the main force, surrounded by perhaps only 100 of his personal guard, as the enemy cavalry circled like sharks scenting blood. The next hours burned themselves into memory with the clarity of nightmare. Every sense seemed preternaturally sharp, as though the gods themselves wanted him to remember each detail of this moment. The copper taste of fear in his mouth, the smell of blood and horse sweat and terror, the sound of men dying in ways that would haunt dreams for years to come. His personal guard fought with desperate valor, forming a shrinking circle around their pharaoh. One by one, men he had known for years, had trained with, had shared wine and stories with, fell to Hittite spears and arrows. Each death was a personal wound, each sacrifice another weight added to the crown he bore. It was then, in that moment of supreme crisis, that something changed within Ramses' soul. As he watched another of his guards fall, taking a spear meant for him, the young pharaoh remembered the ancient writings he had studied since childhood. How many great pharaohs had faced moments like this? How many had turned disaster into the very stuff of legend? Time seemed to slow, the chaos of battle fading to a dull roar as clarity struck him like lightning. This moment, this precise moment, would echo through eternity. Future generations would read of this day, would speak of how Ramses faced annihilation. The only question was, would they speak of his glorious death or his triumphant victory? The choice crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. If he was to die here, he would die in a way that would make the gods themselves pause to watch. If he was to live, he would live as legend. Either way, immortality beckoned. "Amun!" His voice rose above the battle's din, carrying the weight of both prayer and command. "Your son calls to you. Look upon my deeds this day and judge if I am worthy of your divine blood." Then, before his enemies could react, before his own men could move to protect him, Ramses sent his chariot plunging into the thick of the Hittite forces. Mena, understanding his pharaoh's intent without words, guided their horses with the skill of divine inspiration. The chariot became a weapon itself, its scythed wheels cutting through enemy formations, while Ramses' bow sang a song of death. Time lost all meaning as pharaoh and driver carved their way through the enemy host. Each arrow that flew from Ramses' bow, each enemy warrior who fell beneath his chariot's wheels, felt like another stone laid in the foundation of his immortality. He fought not just with the skill Horemheb had taught him, but with the desperate energy of a man who knew that gods and history watched his every move. "I fight alone." The cry tore from his throat, both battle cry and historical proclamation. No prince with me, no general beside me, no archer or chariot warrior. My own eyes see and my own arms strike. 10,000 enemies fall before me, and their blood waters the earth. His words, born of battle fury and divine inspiration, would be carved on temple walls for 3,000 years. But in that moment they were simply truth. His arrows found their marks with uncanny accuracy, while Mena's driving kept them always just beyond the reach of enemy spears. Together they became living embodiments of Egypt's martial glory. The surviving members of his personal guard, inspired by their pharaoh's courage, rallied to his banner. The sight of Ramses fighting like a god made flesh transformed them, burning away fear and fatigue. They became extensions of his divine will, each man fighting with the strength of 10. Hours passed like heartbeats as the battle raged. Ramses felt his arms growing heavy, saw the sweat darkening Mena's back as the driver pushed himself beyond mortal limits. Both men were wounded, nothing serious yet, but the cuts and bruises were beginning to take their toll. The pharaoh's quiver grew lighter with each passing moment, each arrow more precious than gold. Then, just as it seemed their strength must fail, a sound rose from the south, the thunder of approaching chariots. For one terrible moment, Ramses thought it must be more Hittite reinforcements. But then he saw the standards rising above the dust cloud, the Nearin, his elite corps, arriving like an answer to his prayers to Amun. The battlefield's dynamic shifted in an instant. The Hittite forces, who had thought themselves springing a perfect trap, suddenly found themselves caught between Ramses' indomitable defense and the fresh troops charging into their rear. The discipline that had served them so well began to crack. What followed was slaughter. The Nearin struck the Hittite lines like a divine hammer, while Ramses led what remained of his guard in a renewed assault. Caught between these forces, the enemy broke. The retreat became a rout, with Hittite chariots fighting each other in their desperation to escape. The sun was setting by the time the last enemy fled across the Orontes. The river ran red with blood, while the plain before Kadesh was carpeted with the dead and dying. The cost had been enormous. Hundreds of Ramses' best warriors lay among the fallen, their lives given in service to Egypt's glory. But as Ramses stood in his gore-spattered chariot, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon, he felt the weight of something greater than victory settling onto his shoulders. He had crossed a threshold this day, had transcended the boundary between mortal kingship and living legend. The stories of this battle would outlive bronze and stone, would echo down the corridors of time long after his body had returned to the embrace of Osiris. Mena, still at his post despite exhaustion and wounds, spoke softly. "The men whisper that Amun himself fought beside you today, my king." Ramses looked at his driver, this common-born man who had helped forge immortality with his skill and courage. "No, my friend, not Amun. What fought here today was something else, the will to be remembered, the determination that our deeds should echo through eternity." As darkness fell, torches began to spring to life across the battlefield. Priests moved among the dead and dying, offering comfort and recording names for remembrance. Scribes were already at work, transforming the day's events into the first drafts of legend. In years to come, the story would be carved into temple walls, painted on papyrus scrolls repeated in every corner of the empire. How Ramses had stood alone against impossible odds, how divine favor had proven stronger than mortal treachery. But that would come later. For now there were wounds to bind, a dead to honor, and a peace to negotiate. The battle's immediate outcome was at best a stalemate. The fortress of Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, and Mu'attali's army, though bloodied, was not destroyed. Yet Ramses knew that the day's true victory lay not in territorial gains or tactical advantage, but in the story that would be told. He found Horemheb among the survivors, the old general's armor dented and bloody, but his spirit unbroken. "You have done it, my king," the warrior said simply. "You have earned your place among the great ones." Ramses clasped his teacher's shoulder, feeling the weight of all they had shared. "We have all earned something today, old friend. Those who fell will be remembered as long as Egypt stands. Those who lived will tell their grandchildren that they fought beside Ramses at Kadesh." As the stars emerged above the battlefield, Ramses stood among his commanders, planning the next day's movements. But part of his mind was already racing ahead through time, seeing how this day would be remembered. He could almost see the temple walls yet to be built, could almost hear the voices of priests yet unborn, reciting the tale of this battle. He had set out to prove himself worthy of his father's crown. Instead, he had transcended it, had written his name into the book of eternity, with ink mixed from blood and courage and desperate inspiration. The boy who had watched embalmers preserve flesh for eternity now understood a deeper truth. True immortality lay not in natron and bandages, but in deeds that would echo through time itself. The moon rose over Kadesh, its light turning the battlefield silver. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, peace to negotiate, an empire to rule, monuments to build. But for now, Ramses stood among the evidence of his transformation, feeling the mantle of legend settle onto his shoulders like a cloak of stars. He had entered this battle as Ramses, Pharaoh of Egypt. He would leave it as Ramses the Great, whose name would thunder through history like Amun's war cry. The price had been paid in blood and valor, and the gods themselves had borne witness. Now all that remained was to ensure that the tale was told properly, that future generations would understand the full weight of this day's glory. As he finally retired to his tent, Ramses touched the wounds he had received, each one a mark of his mortality, each one a reminder of how close death had come. Yet somehow, these very symbols of his human frailty made the day's achievement more profound. He had faced his limitations and transcended them, had transformed weakness into strength through sheer force of will. The night wind carried the sounds of his army at rest, the murmur of prayers, the groans of the wounded, the quiet conversations of survivors processing what they had witnessed. These sounds, too, would become part of the legend. For in years to come, every man who had fought at Kadesh would tell his own version of the tale, how they had seen their pharaoh transform into living myth, how they had witnessed the birth of greatness. And in that telling and retelling, in that constant renewal of memory, lay the true victory of Kadesh. For Ramses had discovered what every great pharaoh must learn, that immortality was not a gift to be granted by gods or embalmers, but a prize to be seized through actions worthy of remembrance. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal as the gods themselves, while below a legend took its first breath, born in blood and battle on the plains of Kadesh. The tale would grow with each telling, would be carved in stone and painted on papyrus, would be sung by priests and whispered by mothers to their children. And at its heart would always be this day, when a pharaoh faced annihilation and forged from it the keys to eternity. Ambition, like the Nile itself, carved its path through unyielding stone. As dawn painted the cliffs of Abu Simbel in shades of fire and blood, master architect Amenemhat stood before the towering rock face, seeing not what was, but what could be. Surveyors marked the cliff face with red ochre, mapping out the colossal figures that would emerge from the stone. Scaffolding rose like wooden skeletons against the rock. The first blows of bronze chisels against sandstone rang out like war drums, herald trumpet of a different kind of battle. But it was in the worker camps that the true cost began to make itself felt. The summer sun beat down with merciless intensity, turning the construction site into an oven of dust and sweat. Men worked from dawn to dusk, their bodies stretched to breaking point by the constant strain of moving massive stone blocks, the endless chip-chip-chip of carving tools. The first death came 3 weeks into the project. A young laborer, new to the work, lost his footing on the scaffolding. His cry echoed off the cliff face like the voice of Anubis himself, calling souls to judgment. Ramses, who had come to inspect the progress, watched as the body was carried away, noted how work resumed almost immediately. In war, he had learned to accept the necessity of sacrifice. This, he told himself, was no different. But other deaths followed, each one adding its weight to the burden of command. Falls from scaffolding, crushed limbs, the slow toll of exhaustion and heat. The workers began to whisper that the cliff itself was hungry, demanding blood payment for every chunk of stone removed from its face. Kai emerged as a natural leader among the workers, his skill and fairness earning respect from both laborers and overseers. Ramses found himself watching the young artisan, seeing in him something of the same fire that burned in Maya, a determination to excel, tempered by compassion for others. "The men trust him," Nefertari observed one evening as they watched the sunset paint the growing monument in shades of gold. "He speaks for them without speaking against you. Such men are rare and valuable." Ramses nodded, remembering how Maya's intelligence had so often proved useful. "Have your handmaidens keep watch on him, not to spy but to protect. We may have need of his influence in the days to come." The project consumed resources at a staggering rate. Bronze tools wore down and had to be replaced. Water had to be carried up the scaffolding in an endless stream of clay pots. Food for thousands of workers had to be shipped in from the fertile delta. Each day brought new challenges, new demands, new costs to be counted. Master Amenemhat drove himself as hard as any laborer, his obsession with perfection becoming legendary among the workers. He could often be found on the scaffolding before dawn, checking measurements, adjusting plans, driving his vision toward reality with the same relentless energy that had first convinced Ramses to attempt the impossible. "The alignment must be perfect," he would mutter, checking and rechecking his calculations. "The sun must kiss the divine image exactly on the appointed days. Nothing less will serve." The architect's dedication inspired similar commitment in others. Workers began to take pride in their part of the project, competing to see who could achieve the finest finish on the stone, who could cut the straightest line, who could solve the endless technical challenges that arose. But pride alone could not ease the physical burden. The work was brutally hard, the conditions harsh. Families in the worker camp lived in constant fear of accident or illness taking their breadwinners. Children grew up in the shadow of the emerging colossi, playing games that mimicked the work they would likely inherit. 4 months into the project, the first major disaster struck. A section of scaffolding collapsed, taking 12 workers with it. The screams echoed off the cliff face like the wails of the damned. Ramses, who had been inspecting the upper works, watched helplessly as men he had come to know by name fell to their deaths. The aftermath tested his leadership in ways that battle never had. Here there was no enemy to fight, no tactical response possible. There was only grief, fear, and the question that hung in the air like dust. How many more would die before the monument was complete? That night, unable to sleep, Ramses walked alone through the worker camp. The sounds of mourning mixed with the everyday noises of life continuing, children crying, meals being prepared, quiet conversations around cook fires. In one tent, he heard a woman singing a lullaby to her child, the same melody his own mother had once sung. The simple humanity of it struck him harder than any war club. He found himself at the edge of the camp, staring up at the cliff face. In the moonlight, the partially carved features of his colossal likeness seemed to stare back with empty eyes that held either judgment or understanding. He could not tell which. The question that had haunted him since childhood pressed against his mind. What price was too high for immortality? His calloused fingers traced invisible lines across the cliff's weathered surface, mapping out a vision that would either immortalize him or destroy him, perhaps both. Behind him, Ramses watched with the calculating eye of one who had learned to weigh glory against its price. The pharaoh's shadow stretched across the sand, like a god's hand reaching for eternity, while around him gathered the architects, priests, and nobles who would help forge his legacy, or stand in its way. "Show me," Ramses commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had been tempered in the fires of Kadesh. Amenemhat moved with the fluid grace of one who had spent decades turning dreams into stone. His measuring rod swept through the air, describing shapes that existed only in his mind's eye. "Here, my king, are 4 colossi, each as tall as 7 men standing on each other's shoulders. Your likeness carved from living rock, gazing out across the Nile for all time. The morning sun will strike their faces, making them glow like divine flesh." The architect's voice took on the cadence of prophecy as he continued. "Behind them, a temple that will pierce the mountain's heart. The entranceway aligned so precisely that twice each year, on your birthday and coronation day, the rising sun will reach into the innermost sanctuary, illuminating your divine image seated among the gods themselves." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. Even for Egypt, where architectural ambition was measured in pyramids, this vision stretched the boundaries of possibility. Ramses caught fragments of their whispered doubts. The cost? Impossible. The gods themselves would balk. But it was Nefertari's reaction that truly caught his attention. His queen stood slightly apart from the others, her face bearing the same expression she had worn when planning decisive moves in their youth, a mixture of calculation and concern that had so often proven prophetic. The technical challenges alone. Master K, the elder architect who had overseen the completion of Seti's temple at Abydos, shook his head. The precision required for the solar alignment, the risk of the rock face splitting during excavation, the sheer scale of material to be removed. It can be done. Amenemhat's certainty cut through the doubts like a bronze blade. I have spent 5 years studying this cliff, testing the stone, measuring the sun's path. With sufficient resources and labor, I can make your divine image permanent, my king. I can burn your glory into the living rock itself." Ramses stepped forward, placing his hand against the sun-warmed stone. Through his palm, he could almost feel the potential sleeping in the rock, the greatness waiting to be revealed by chisel and sweat and sacrifice. This was what he had dreamed of since those first days in the embalming chamber, a monument that would transcend mere flesh and bone, that would proclaim his power to endless generations. "How many workers?" he asked, his tone making it clear he wanted truth, not flattery. Amenemhat hesitated for the first time. 3,000 at minimum, skilled stoneworkers, engineers, artists, and— He took a breath. "Perhaps twice that many laborers for the heavy work. The project will take at least 20 years. 20 years? Kay's protest was immediate. The Treasury cannot support such a prolonged undertaking. The strain on resources, the displacement of farming communities. The gods themselves demand this monument." High Priest Amenemhat, no relation to the architect, stepped forward, his leopard skin cloak catching the morning light. "The divine Ramses must have a house worthy of his glory." But Ramses raised a hand, silencing them all. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating costs both material and human. He had learned at Kadesh that glory's price was always paid in blood. The only question was how much and by whom. "Begin," he commanded simply. Then, turning to his administrators, "Send word throughout Egypt. We require workers, both skilled and common labor. Make it known that service on this project will bring rewards both material and spiritual." The word spread like flame through dry reeds. Within weeks, the first workers began arriving: stonemasons from Memphis, engineers from Heliopolis, artists from Thebes. They came drawn by promises of payment in both copper and divine favor. Among them was Kai, Maya's brother, whose skill with a chisel had already earned him renown in the artisans' quarter of Thebes. Watching the worker camps spring up like mushrooms after rain, Ramses was reminded of army encampments before battle. The same energy hummed in the air, anticipation mixed with anxiety, ambition tempered by fear. But unlike soldiers, these men brought their families, creating a new city of tents and temporary shelters that sprawled along the riverbank. The work began with the precision of a military campaign. The answer came not in words, but in the sound of hammers starting up before dawn. The workers returned to their tasks, driven by some combination of necessity, pride, and the human urge to create something lasting. Their courage shamed him, their dedication humbled him. Ramses ordered changes after the disaster. Safety measures were improved, work shifts adjusted to avoid the worst heat of the day, rations increased. The project's cost rose accordingly. But he had learned at Kadesh that true leadership meant bearing the full weight of responsibility for those under his command. When the first face emerged fully from the stone, after nearly a year of constant labor, even the most hardened workers paused to stare in awe. The massive visage caught the morning light like a newly risen sun, its features bearing both the power of divine kingship and something more subtle, a hint of human understanding in the mighty Pharaoh's expression. Master Amenemhat wept openly when he saw it, his usual precision cracking under the weight of achievement. "Do you see, my king?" he asked, gesture encompassing both the finished face and the work yet to come. "This is how gods are born, not in the temples of Memphis or the palaces of Thebes, but here in dust and sweat and sacrifice." Ramses studied his stone reflection, seeing in it both what he was and what he hoped to become. The face looked toward eternity with calm certainty, as though the cost of its creation was a price willingly paid for endless remembrance. But the pharaoh himself felt less certain, more aware with each passing day of the human weight of his ambition. That evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs that would bear his image until the end of time, Ramses stood with Nefertari in their private pavilion. The sounds of construction were muted here, but still present, a constant reminder of the work that never truly ceased. "Do you remember," she asked quietly, "what you told me the day after Kadesh? About immortality being something seized rather than granted?" He nodded, watching the last light fade from the west. "Perhaps," she continued, it is also something shared. These workers, these families, they are not just building your monument. They are weaving their own lives into its foundation. Their stories will be part of its story, their sacrifices part of its strength. The truth of her words settled onto his shoulders like another piece of royal regalia. This project was more than stone and ambition. It was thousands of individual lives being shaped by the work. Thousands of personal stories becoming part of a greater narrative. As darkness claimed the day, Ramses could hear the evening prayers rising from the worker camp, smell the cook fires preparing the evening meal, sense the vast web of human connections that had grown up around his dream of eternal remembrance. The monument was growing day by day, carved from living rock by living hands. But something else was growing too, an understanding that true greatness lay not just in what was built, but in how it was built, and at what cost. The stars emerged above the cliffs of Abu Simbel, eternal as the gods themselves, while below the great work continued. Each chip of stone removed, each life touched or lost, each decision made or deferred, added its weight to the scales of history. The path to immortality, Ramses was learning, led not just through grand gestures and mighty works, but through the countless small moments of human courage, sacrifice, and determination that gave those works their true meaning. Blood had stained these stones before. It would stain them again. The truth of this thought pressed against Ramses' mind as he stood atop the scaffolding at Abu Simbel, watching the gathering storm below. 3,000 workers had laid down their tools at dawn, their silence more deafening than any protest could have been. At their head stood Kai, Maya's brother, his quiet dignity making him more dangerous than any sword-wielding rebel. The summer sun beat down like divine judgment, while dust devils danced between the half-finished colossi like spirits of the restless dead. 5 years of labor had transformed the cliff face into something approaching immortality, but at a cost that could no longer be ignored. The human foundation of Ramses' eternal dream was beginning to crack. They say the gods themselves weep at our suffering. Kai's voice carried clearly across the construction yard, pitched to reach both his fellow workers and the royal audience above. They say the stones drink our blood and sweat, yet still thirst for more. 300 dead in 5 years, my king. How many more will your glory demand? The words struck Ramses like physical blows, each one weighted with truth he could not deny. He had watched the toll mount year by year, the crushed limbs, the broken bodies, the slow deaths from exhaustion and disease. Each loss had been noted, each sacrifice counted, but always against the measure of eternal achievement. Now that calculation itself was being called into question. Nefertari stepped forward, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "Let me speak with them," she said quietly. "There may still be a path that serves both justice and necessity." But before Ramses could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the gathered workers. A group of overseers, led by the zealous Nakht, had taken it upon themselves to restore order. The clash of wood on bronze rang out as clubs met tools raised in defense. The delicate balance of protest collapsed into chaos. "Hold!" Ramses' voice thundered across the construction yard, but it came too late. Kai had stepped between the overseers and his fellow workers, hands raised in peaceful supplication. Nakht's club caught him across the temple, with the dull sound of destiny taking an irrevocable turn. Time seemed to slow as Maya's brother fell. Ramses, who had seen countless men die in battle, found this single death somehow heavier than all the glory of Kadesh. The workers' crowd surged forward with a roar of grief and rage, while the overseers fell back in sudden understanding of their mistake. What followed would be recorded differently in different chronicles. The official temple accounts would speak of divine authority, restored through necessary force. The workers' oral histories would tell of martyrdom and murder. The truth, as Ramses witnessed it, lay in the blood-stained dust between these extremes. The riots lasted 3 days. When they finally ended, 40 more names had been added to the monument's cost. The work gangs returned to their tasks under doubled guards, their silence now heavy with something darker than mere protest. Ramses felt the change in every face that turned away from his gaze, every back that bent more stiffly to its labor. That night, alone in his pavilion, the pharaoh faced the hardest audience of all, his own reflection in a bronze mirror. The face that looked back at him was not the one being carved into the cliff face, not the serene, eternal visage of divine kingship, but the weathered countenance of a man who had thought himself prepared for power's price. "Was there another way?" he asked the empty air. "There is always another way," Nefertari answered from the doorway. "The question is whether we can see it in time." The next weeks saw changes at Abu Simbel. New policies were implemented. Better rations, improved medical care, regular rest periods. The families of the dead received generous compensation. But these material adjustments, necessary as they were, could not address the deeper wound that had been opened. Ramses found himself spending more time among the workers, not in formal inspection, but in quiet observation. He watched fathers teaching sons the skills of stonework, saw women maintaining the complex web of camp life, heard children playing games that mimicked the great work above. Gradually, he began to understand what Nefertari had meant about immortality being something shared. The project continued, but with a different rhythm. The massive faces emerged from the cliff one by one, each one bearing not just Ramses' features, but the accumulated weight of all who had worked to reveal them. The temple complex grew deeper into the mountain's heart, its walls coming alive with scenes of battle and triumph, of divine blessing and royal power. Master Amenemhat drove himself and his craftsmen toward perfection with even greater intensity, as though artistic excellence could somehow balance the human cost. His health began to fail, but he refused to leave the site, even when fever racked his body. "The alignment must be perfect," he insisted from his sickbed, his voice thick with more than illness. "The sun must reach the inner sanctuary. The light must touch divinity itself." Ramses sat with the architect through his final night, listening as the old man's devotion to beauty and precision battled with his growing awareness of mortality. Near the end, Amenemhat grabbed the pharaoh's arm with surprising strength. "I see it now," he whispered. "The monument is not in the stone. It's in the space between the stone and those who shaped it, in the dreams and sweat and sacrifice. That's what will echo through eternity." The architect died as dawn was breaking over his life's great work. Ramses ordered him entombed within the temple complex itself, his name carved alongside those of princes and priests. It was an unprecedented honor for a commoner, but as the pharaoh explained to his scandalized nobles, the man who gave his life to create a house for the gods deserves to rest within its walls. As the project entered its final phases, a new understanding seemed to spread through the worker camps. The anger did not disappear, but it transformed into something more complex. A fierce pride in the work itself, a determination that their sacrifice should produce something truly worthy of remembrance. The day the sun first reached the inner sanctuary was proclaimed a holiday for all workers. They gathered with their families to witness the moment when divine light penetrated the mountain's heart, illuminating the seated figures of Ramses and the gods. The precision of the alignment was perfect, just as Amenemhat had demanded. When the first ray struck the pharaoh's stone face, a gasp of genuine awe rose from the crowd. Ramses stood among his people, feeling the weight of both triumph and cost. The monument was a masterpiece, there was no denying that. It would speak his name to countless generations, would proclaim his power long after his mortal flesh had returned to dust. But its true strength, he now understood, lay not in the perfection of its proportions or the precision of its astronomical alignment, but in the human story of its creation. That evening, as the workers celebrated with a feast provided from the royal treasury, Ramses walked the quiet temple corridors with Nefertari. Their footsteps echoed off walls that would carry their sound for millennia to come. "Listen," she said softly. "The stones remember." And in the gathering darkness, Ramses could almost hear them, the chunk of chisel on stone, the creak of wooden scaffolds, the songs workers sang to ease their labor, the prayers of wives for their husbands' safety, the laughter of children playing in the shadow of growing gods. These were the true materials from which immortality was built. The final dedication ceremony lasted 7 days. Priests chanted endless prayers, offerings piled up before the giant images, and the name of Ramses was carved one last time into the eternal stone. But it was the unofficial ceremony that followed which struck deeper into the pharaoh's heart. The workers and their families processed through the temple at sunset, each one carrying a small clay lamp. They moved in silence through the corridors their labor had created, past walls their skill had decorated, under ceilings their strength had raised. The light of thousands of tiny flames brought the carved reliefs to living motion, while shadows danced like memories given form. Watching from the inner sanctuary, Ramses felt the full weight of what had been achieved and what it had cost. The monument would indeed speak his name through eternity, but it would speak other names as well. Every stroke of the chisel, every drop of blood, every moment of despair and triumph had left its mark on the living stone. As the last light faded from the western sky, Ramses stood before his colossal images, looking up at faces that were both his and not his. They stared into eternity with the calm certainty of gods, while below mortal men and women began the work of packing up their camps, preparing to return to fields and cities across Egypt. The great work was complete, but its echoes would ripple outward through time like circles from a stone cast into the Nile. Other monuments would follow, the Ramesseum rising in eternal stone, great temples taking shape at Karnak and Luxor, statues and obelisks proclaiming power and permanence. But none would carry quite the same weight as Abu Simbel, where the price of immortality had been measured in full and paid without discount. The stars emerged above the finished monument, eternal as the gods themselves, while below, a pharaoh who had sought to carve his name in eternity stood in quiet contemplation. He had succeeded in his ambition. The name of Ramses would indeed echo through the ages, but the echo would carry more than he had initially intended. Not just the story of divine power and royal might, but the tale of human cost and human triumph, of mortality reaching toward immortality one chisel stroke at a time. As he turned to walk away, Ramses paused for one final look at his great work. The massive faces caught the starlight like giants waking from stone sleep, their eyes fixed on an horizon that mortal sight could never reach. They would stand guard here until the end of time, watching generations flow past like the river below, telling their tale to all who had eyes to see and hearts to understand. The tale they told would be both simpler and more complex than the one he had originally planned. It would speak not just of a pharaoh's power, but of humanity's eternal reach toward greatness, of the price willingly paid for the chance to touch immortality. In the end, perhaps that was the truest monument of all. Not the stone that had been carved, but the lives that had done the carving. The night wind carried the smell of the river and the distant sound of workers' families preparing for their journeys home. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, new dreams to be carved from unyielding stone. But for now, in this moment between completion and consequence, Ramses allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had been achieved and what it had cost. This was how gods were made, not through divine decree, but through human hands and human hearts, through sweat and blood and dreams given form in living stone. The price was high, perhaps too high, but it had been paid in full. Now only time would tell if the purchase had been worth its cost. Time, that most patient of sculptors, had carved new lines into Ramses's face that no monument would ever show. As dawn painted the temple walls in shades of memory, the pharaoh's weathered hand traced the smooth perfection of his stone likeness at Abu Simbel. 80 years had passed since he first watched embalmers at their eternal work, 66 since he took the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, in the gathering light of his final years, he stood between what he had been and what he would forever be. His reflection in the polished granite showed a face that time had transformed but not conquered. The proud nose remained, though age had sharpened it like a blade worn thin by constant use. His eyes still held the piercing quality that had commanded armies, though now they peered out from beneath heavy lids carved by decades of divine responsibility. The once black hair had turned white as temple limestone, but it still crowned his head like the divine uraeus he wore in ceremony. Around him, the morning routine of temple life began its ancient dance. Priests moved through their ritual duties, their whispered prayers mixing with the eternal song of the Nile below. But beneath these familiar sounds lay another rhythm, the never-ending ring of chisel on stone, the grunt of laborers hauling blocks, the creation of yet more monuments to ensure his name would echo through eternity. My king. The voice belonged to Amenemhat, grandson of the architect who had given his life to create this very temple. The surveyor's reports from Karnak have arrived. The new pylons rise according to plan. Ramses nodded, but his attention had caught on something else, a small imperfection in the temple wall where water had begun its slow work of erosion. Even stone was not eternal, it seemed. Even mountains could be worn away by time's patient fingers. The walk back to his private chambers took longer than it once had. His leg, broken in that long-ago battle at Kadesh, and never quite the same since, protested each step. Young priests moved to assist him, but he waved them away with a dignity that age had tempered but not diminished. He was still Ramses the Great, who had stood alone against 2,000 Hittite chariots. He would walk unassisted while his legs could bear him. In his chambers he found Nefertari's latest message waiting. His great queen had retired to her own palace at Memphis, the summer heat of Thebes too much for her declining health. Her words, written in the precise hieroglyphs she had always favored, carried both love and warning. "The physicians speak of shadows in my blood, my beloved. Time grows short. Come to me while you still can, if you would share final words with she who has walked beside you through glory and grief." The papyrus crackled in his tightening grip. For all his power, for all the monuments he had raised and armies he had commanded, he could not halt the advance of mortality's quiet army. Not for her, not for himself, not for any who walked beneath Ra's burning eye. The journey to Memphis took 6 days, his royal barge fighting upstream against the Nile's endless flow. He stood at the prow each morning, watching Egypt pass by like a living scroll of his achievements. Here a temple he had commanded built, there a statue raising his name to heaven, everywhere the marks of his reign carved into the very flesh of the land. But it was the unchanging things that caught his eye now. The peasants in their fields, the children swimming in the shallows, the fishermen casting their nets as their ancestors had done since the first dawn. They lived their lives beneath the shadow of his monuments, speaking his name in prayer and praise, but their rhythms remained as eternal as the river itself. Nefertari waited in her garden, seated beneath a canopy of flowering acacias. Time had touched her too, but gently, adding silver to her hair like moonlight on still water. Her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had helped forge an empire, though now they seemed focused on more distant horizons. "You've been counting again," she said as he sat beside her. No other greeting needed between souls who had shared so much of life. "I see it in your face, counting the costs, measuring the weight of eternity against its price." 300,000 blocks in the Ramesseum alone, he answered, falling into the old pattern of their conversations. 40 years to build. How many lives spent in its raising? How many families uprooted? How many dreams ground to dust beneath our dreams of forever? She reached for his hand, her touch still sure despite the tremors that had begun to plague her. And how many fed by its building? How many children grew strong because their fathers earned a steady wage? How many skills passed down? How many stories told? The ledger has 2 sides, my love. Always remember that. They sat in comfortable silence as the garden's shadows lengthened. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the city hummed with life. Craftsmen at their work, merchants crying their wares, priests chanting eternal prayers in temples that bore Ramses' name alongside those of the gods themselves. "I would preserve you," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of decades of shared purpose. "Let me command it. The finest embalmers, the most perfect tomb, your name carved beside mine in every monument still to rise." Nefertari's laugh held the same musical quality it had when they were young, though now it ended in a cough that sent a spike of fear through his heart. "And compete with Hathor herself for beauty through eternity. No, my love, let me go as I lived, beside you but not overshadowed by you. Let my name be remembered in connection with yours, but let it be remembered truly." In the days that followed, they spoke of many things, of battles fought beneath distant skies, of temples raised stone by precious stone, of children grown to adulthood beneath the weight of his legend. But mostly they spoke of the space between achievement and cost, between ambition's bright flame and its smoking aftermath. "Do you remember that day at Kadesh?" she asked one evening, as the sun set behind the palace gardens. "When you stood alone against the Hittite chariots, I was not alone, he corrected, the memory still sharp despite the decades that had passed. Amun stood with me. Did he? Her voice held genuine curiosity rather than challenge. Or did you stand with the strength of your own conviction, with the courage that makes men godlike through their actions rather than their births? The question lingered in the air between them, heavy with implications about divinity and humanity, about the nature of greatness itself. Before he could find an answer, a fit of coughing seized her, and this time the cloth she pressed to her lips came away stained with blood. The next weeks passed with the terrible swiftness of sand through an hourglass. Ramses watched as death approached his queen with the same patient certainty that had worn away at his monuments. All his power, all his glory, could not add a single grain to time's measure. On her last night, as the stars emerged like memories in the darkening sky, Nefertari spoke of legacy. Her voice was weak, but her mind remained sharp as a sculptor's blade. "You have built in stone," she whispered, "but the greatest monuments are built in hearts. Remember that when I am gone. Remember that when you look upon your works and question their worth." She died as dawn was breaking over Memphis, her hand still clasped in his, her last breath carrying away something vital that all his achievements could not replace. Ramses, who had commanded armies and raised mountains of stone, found himself powerless before the simple finality of death. The mourning ceremonies lasted 70 days, as tradition demanded. Ramses supervised every detail, ensuring that her tomb would be as perfect as his love for her demanded. But even as the priests chanted their prayers and the embalmers worked their ancient arts, he felt the hollow victory of preservation without presence. When he returned to Thebes, he found that time had not paused in its eternal dance. Construction continued on his monuments. Armies patrolled his borders, and the machinery of empire ground on with the same relentless precision as the stars wheeling overhead. But something had changed, not in the world, but in how he saw it. He began to walk among his great works with new eyes, seeing not just the triumph of their creation, but the human cost of their raising. Each perfectly fitted stone, each exquisitely carved hieroglyph, carried the weight of countless individual lives. The scribes recorded numbers, how many blocks, how many years, how many talents of gold, but they could not record the dreams deferred, the families separated, the simple joys forsaken in service to eternal glory. One evening, as the setting sun turned the Nile to liquid fire, Ramses stood before the great pylon of Luxor Temple. The massive gate bore his name in letters tall as 3 men, proclaiming his divinity to endless generations. But as he studied the ancient stone, he found his attention drawn to the smaller marks, a mason's guideline still visible at the corner, a workman's corrections smoothed over but not quite invisible, the subtle signs of human hands that had shaped divinity from raw stone. A group of children played in the temple's shadow, their game involving the mimicry of construction work. One small boy stood atop a wooden block, striking poses that perfectly captured the pharaoh's own stance in countless reliefs. The sight brought an unexpected smile to Ramses' lips. Here was an immortality no amount of stone could capture or contain. That night, unable to sleep, he read through the letters and documents that had accumulated during his morning seclusion. Reports of border skirmishes, proposals for new monuments, requests for royal judgment on 1,000 matters great and small. But it was a simple clay tablet from one of his sons that caught and held his attention. "Great Father, I have visited the workers' village at the Valley of Kings. There I heard songs they sing as they labor, songs that tell of your victories at Kadesh, of the great temples you have raised, of the prosperity you have brought to Egypt. But they also sing of smaller things, of your justice in settling disputes, of your courage in facing loss, of your wisdom in balancing divine power with human understanding. Perhaps this, as much as any monument, is how you will be remembered." The words echoed in his mind as he stood on his palace balcony, watching the stars emerge above Thebes. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the eternal sound of construction, his latest monument rising stone by stone toward heaven. But now he heard something else beneath the ring of chisel on stone, the songs of workers, the laughter of children, the prayers of priests, the whispered stories of common people. These too were monuments of a sort, built not of stone, but of memory and meaning. The night wind carried the scent of lotus blossoms and incense, of river water and desert sand. Ramses breathed it in, feeling the weight of years and glory pressing against his chest. He had sought to carve his name in eternity, to ensure that time itself could not erase his memory from the world. In this, he had succeeded beyond any pharaoh's dreams. But as he stood beneath the infinite Egyptian sky, he wondered if perhaps he had succeeded in ways he had not intended. His monuments would stand until time itself grew tired, yes, but perhaps his true immortality lay not in their perfect proportions or eternal stone, but in the stories told around cook fires, in the songs sung to children, in the way his achievements had shaped not just Egypt's skyline but her soul. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal as the gods themselves, while below, an aged pharaoh contemplated the true measure of immortality. He had built in stone and glory, had carved his name so deep in history's flesh that time itself would bleed before forgetting him. But as Nefertari had tried to tell him, perhaps the most enduring monuments were those built in hearts rather than stone. Dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with colors no artist could capture. Soon the eternal work would begin again, more stones raised, more hieroglyphs carved, more glory added to glory. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, between achievement and cost, between human and divine, Ramses the Great stood alone with the weight of his accomplishments and the price they had demanded. Tomorrow would bring new reports of construction, new plans for monuments, new ways to ensure his name would echo through eternity. But tonight, he was content to listen to the quiet music of his empire, the songs of workers, the prayers of priests, the stories of common people. These too were his monuments, perhaps more lasting than any temple or statue could ever be. History whispered from every stone of Thebes as Ramses gazed upon his city for what he knew would be the last time. 92 years had carved their testimony into his flesh, yet his eyes remained sharp enough to count every monument that thrust its spires toward heaven's vault. The morning sun painted their peaks in shades of flame and glory, as though Ra himself blessed the works that had transformed Egypt's skyline into an eternal proclamation of power. The great pharaoh stood on his palace balcony, leaning slightly on a staff carved from cedar of Lebanon. His body had begun to bow beneath time's relentless pressure, but his spine remained straight as a spear when in public view. He had learned long ago that a pharaoh's image belonged not to himself, but to history's hungry eye. Below, the city stirred to life like a great beast waking. The sounds rose to him in layers, the eternal song of the Nile's flow, the cry of merchants in the market squares, the ring of chisels as yet more monuments rose stone by stone toward immortality. But beneath these familiar rhythms, he caught a new note, the whispered prayers of his people, not to Amun or Osiris, but to Ramses himself. Already, while his heart still beat, they had begun to worship him as a living god. "My king." The voice belonged to his eldest surviving son, Kamwaset, now well past 60 himself. The astronomers report an alignment of stars not seen since the reign of Thutmose III. They say it heralds great change. Ramses smiled, though the expression carried more wisdom than mirth. "Everything heralds great change, my son, to those who make their living reading omens. But perhaps this time, they speak truth." He had felt death's approach for weeks now, its shadow falling across his path, with the same inexorable certainty as night following day. But unlike Nefertari's passing, which had torn his heart with its suddenness, this was a slower dance, a measured retreat from life's battlements. It gave him time to consider, to weigh, to judge the true measure of his achievements against their cost. That afternoon he commanded his litter-bearers to carry him through the streets of Thebes one final time. The journey became a triumph he had not intended, as word of his presence spread ahead of him like flame through dry reeds. People poured from their homes and shops to line his path, pressing forward to touch his litter, to call out blessings, to add their voices to the growing legend that was already replacing the man. They passed his greatest monuments one by one. The Ramesseum rose like a mountain of mankind's making, its columns soaring toward heaven with eternal aspiration. The Temple of Luxor, where his name was carved so deep that time itself would weep before erasing it. Karnak, where his statues dwarfed those of all who had come before, their perfect proportions proclaiming power to endless generations. But it was the smaller marks of his reign that caught his eye now. The prosperous shops in the market district, the well-fed children playing in the streets, the profound peace that lay across his lands like a blessing. These too were monuments of a sort, though they would leave no trace for future ages to marvel at. As sunset approached, he commanded his bearers to stop at the Temple of Amun. Here, where he had first donned the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, he would complete his final official act as Pharaoh. The high priest, grandson of the man who had crowned him so long ago, waited at the top of the steps. The climb was difficult, each step a battle against time's gathering weight. But Ramses refused assistance, drawing instead on reserves of will that had once held back 2,000 Hittite chariots. When he reached the temple door, he stood for a moment framed against the setting sun, letting his people see in him the same strength that had forged an empire. Inside the temple's sacred depths, past pillars that soared like preserved prayers, he came at last to the sanctuary of Amun himself. Here, in the holy darkness, lit only by flickering oil lamps, Ramses faced the god he had claimed as father. "I have raised your temples," he said into the shadows. "I have carved your name beside mine in eternal stone. I have ruled as your son, fought as your champion, built as your architect. Now tell me truly, was it enough? Did I earn the divinity I claimed?" Only silence answered, but perhaps that too was an answer of sorts. The gods, he had learned, spoke most clearly in silence, in the spaces between heartbeats where wisdom waited for those patient enough to listen. Later, in his private chambers, he summoned his scribes one final time. They came bearing palettes and papyrus, ready to record whatever words of power or glory he wished to leave as his last testament. But Ramses surprised them with his commands. "Write this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 92 years of rule. "Let it be known that Ramses, son of Seti, twice raised to the throne of Upper and Lower Egypt, commander of armies, builder of temples, beloved of Amun, achieved all that he set out to achieve. His name will indeed echo through eternity. His monuments will outlast bronze and granite. But let it also be known that he learned in the fullness of time that immortality wears many faces, and not all of them are carved in stone." The scribe's reeds scratched across papyrus, recording words that would be copied and recopied countless times in the ages to come. But Ramses was not finished. Write that he came to understand that true legacy lies not in the height of temples or the weight of gold, but in the lives touched and changed. Write that he built not just in stone and statues, but in the hearts and stories of his people. And write this above all, that he paid eternity's price in full, counting the cost not just in blocks of granite, but in drops of blood and mortal dreams. That night, as darkness gathered around his palace like mourners at a tomb, Ramses felt the last grains of his life's hourglass beginning to run out. His chambers filled with priests and physicians, their whispered prayers and remedies, a constant susurration like wind through temple columns. But he had commanded that his family be allowed to remain as well, not just his surviving children, but their children and theirs, 4 generations of living legacy gathered to witness his passage into legend. As midnight approached, he beckoned his eldest great-grandchild closer. The boy, no more than 7, came forward with the perfect balance of respect and curiosity that youth allows. Ramses studied him in the lamplight, seeing in those young eyes the same fire that had once burned in his own. "Remember this moment," he told the child, his voice carrying clearly despite its weakness. "Remember that you saw Ramses the Great pass from man to myth. But remember too what I tell you now, that greatness lies not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we build for others. The monuments will stand, yes, but the true test of a pharaoh's worth lies in the lives of his people." The hours crept past like mourners in a funeral procession. Ramses felt his grip on life loosening gradually, like a rider letting go of reins at the end of a long journey. But his mind remained sharp, turning over and over the central question that had dominated his final years. Had it been worth it? The cost in lives and labor, in sweat and suffering, in dreams delayed or denied? Had the price of immortality been too high? The answer came to him as dawn approached, carried on the first rays of sun reaching through his window. He saw suddenly that the question itself was wrong. The price of immortality was not something that could be measured in any single currency. Not in blocks of stone or drops of blood, not in years of labor or talents of gold. The true price and the true worth lay in the total sum of all that had been spent and all that had been gained, in the vast tapestry of consequences that rippled out from every choice and change. His monuments would stand, yes. His name would echo. But his true immortality lay in the stories that would be told around evening fires, in the songs sung by mothers to their children, in the changes he had wrought in the very fabric of Egypt's soul. He had built in stone, but also in spirit. He had carved his name in granite, but also in memory. The sun rose fully over Thebes, painting his final moments in the same colors that had greeted his first. As death approached with quiet certainty, Ramses felt not fear but a profound sense of completion. He had paid eternity's price, had bargained with time itself, and had won something perhaps greater than the simple immortality he had first sought. "Remember," he whispered to those gathered around him, his voice growing weaker but his eyes still bright with inner fire. "Remember not just the glory, but the cost. Remember not just the Pharaoh, but the man." Remember. The last word faded into silence as Ramses the Great, living Horus, son of Amun, beloved of the gods, slipped away from life and into legend. The priests began their death chants immediately, their voices rising and falling like waves on eternity's shore. The embalmers were summoned, the 70 days of preparation for eternal life begun. But even as they worked their ancient arts, preserving his mortal flesh for its journey into endless night, Ramses had already achieved an immortality beyond their power to grant or sustain. His name lived in the prayers of millions, his works touched the sky, his legacy was carved into the very bedrock of civilization itself. 3,000 years would pass. Empires would rise and fall like waves on time's ocean. Other men would build their monuments and proclaim their own immortality. But still the name of Ramses would echo. Still his works would inspire awe. Still his story would be told and retold in endless variations. Archaeologists would uncover his works and marvel at their precision. Tourists would stand before his colossi at Abu Simbel and feel their hearts skip a beat. Scholars would debate his achievements and analyze his methods. And through it all, his name would continue to speak across the centuries, carrying with it not just the thunder of power, but the whisper of wisdom hard-won and dearly bought. In the end, Ramses' greatest monument was not any single temple or statue, not any victory carved in stone or painted on temple walls. It was the total sum of all he had achieved and all it had cost, the complete tapestry of triumph and tragedy, of ambition and price, of human greatness reaching toward divine permanence. The sun set on the day of his death, painting the monuments of Thebes in shades of flame and shadow. But even as darkness gathered, even as morning began, even as the priests commenced their endless prayers, something new was being born. The man was becoming myth, the Pharaoh transforming into legend, the story beginning its long journey through time's endless corridors. And perhaps in some realm beyond mortal understanding, Ramses smiled as he watched his name take wing, freed at last from the bonds of mere flesh and stone, to soar through eternity on the winds of memory and meaning. He had paid the price, he had earned his immortality, and in the end he had understood its truest and most lasting form. The stars emerged above Thebes, eternal as the gods themselves, while below, the story of Ramses the Great began its long journey through time. It travels still, carried not just in stone and statues, but in the endless human capacity for wonder, for memory, for the telling and retelling of tales that speak to the highest aspirations of the soul. And so the tale ends, though the echo continues. The monuments still stand, the name still speaks, the legacy still teaches its eternal lessons about power and pride, about glory and its price, about the complex algebra of ambition and cost that all great lives must solve. In the end, Ramses earned his immortality not just through what he built, but through what he came to understand. And perhaps that understanding, that wisdom carved not in stone but in the human heart, is his most enduring monument of all.